One of the first things to remember when you're writing this essay, again, it's not a reflection paper. It's not going to be written in a journal stream of consciousness informal way. This is going to be structured like a formal essay, and it's an analysis, exploratory analysis of your diagnostic and of the process that you have gone through in these different modules. So when you're approaching it, you want to establish some kind of purpose for your audience. So you want to think about who your audience is and what you want them to understand about what has happened to you in this process. Now, this writer has taken the approach of the communication model and culture and focused on the fact that, she felt there was a gap between her own writing and American writing because of her home country, Korea in this case. But what you'll notice is she has not isolated that just to the introductory paragraph. She's brought it through the entire paper, and so you're going to see some balance here. I'm just going to kind of go to one of her other points so that you can see her recycle this idea. For example, here she starts to talk about coherence, which is one of the modules, so it's possible that you might write a paragraph about coherence in yours. But you can see how she's identified her own gap by referring back to this concept that she introduced in the introduction. Because she's a foreign writer, that part might be more difficult for her in translation and talking about the communication model. So you'll notice that a lot of the modules relate back to this idea of culture, audience, purpose, and the communication model. Keep that in mind. You want to provide balance and a kind of coherence, not just at the paragraph level, but at the entire essay level. So then you would expect in her conclusion as well for her to talk about the same thing, which she does. She talks again about it, but in the conclusion, she has evolved this idea. She's not just repeating exactly what she said in the introduction. By the end, those ideas should have evolved more. So if we just go back up to give you an example of what I'm talking about as far as demonstrating, not only do you need to talk about these different things and talk about your process and the revision process, but you also need to be able to demonstrate them. So, for example, if we look at this paragraph on pi structure, she said she's given a reference to the American standards for writing and said, okay, this is what writing is supposed to be. And she could have gone so far as to cite the course material here if she wanted to, but we're not actually going to cover citations and paraphrasing and all of that until the second unit. And so since we haven't covered that yet, but if you do cite something directly from the course material, do make sure that you provide a source there. So she says then what pi is and what it could be used for. And so now I would expect some kind of illustration, right? Because in pi structure, first we make a point. So her point is, well, you have to have logic and therefore you have to have pi. So this is the point that she's making, how important it is. Her demonstration then, her illustration, is here. She brings in a sample specifically labeling the point and the signal phrase and the illustration from her own writing. And then she goes on to say, okay, however, it ends with the illustration, it's missing the explanation, and then she says, if I revised it. And actually, you should go so far as to say, a revision would be, because that would sort of be a two-step illustration. Here's an illustration of what went wrong, here's an illustration of what it should be, and then we would expect her to provide us an explanation, which she does. Okay, so through this process, the paragraph would be improved in order to be more logical. It brings the point home with the explanation. So that's what we're looking for you to do in Essay 1. You will want to select based on what you've done in your engineering activities, which one of these do you feel was the most prominent, the most comment worthy out of all the engineering activities that you did, and then go back through those, see what you wrote about it. And most of the, in fact, all of the materials that you should need in order to write this paper are either going to come from your original diagnostic, your engineering activities, and the course materials. Just make sure that you're not copying and pasting large amounts of your original diagnostic in here. Try to integrate it as much as possible so that you're really writing an analysis and writing a paper instead of just trying to make the same points that you made in your diagnostic essay again, because that was a different topic. This is more of an exploratory analysis essay, whereas your diagnostic was more of a persuasive. You were choosing a standpoint in that one. Okay, so just to go back to this one more time, the steps that you're going to be taking to write your essay 1 diagnostic analysis. The first thing you'll do is collect materials, look over the assignment again, make sure you know what we're asking you to do, review the material, consult the rubric, and compile your engineering activities. And again, you know, the sample essay is there to help guide you, but make sure that you are taking your own approach to the organization and structure of your essay, and that you take an original angle to it. You don't want to be copying the same thing that was in your sample essay, because that's definitely not the only way to do it. Then you're going to be selecting, determine what your purpose is going to be. What is your angle? Why are you writing this analysis? Decide on the main ideas that you would like to cover in your essay, and then consider what you're going to give your audience. So, in other words, what's the difference going to be between the approach to your purpose in the introduction and the approach to your purpose in the conclusion? And then finally, when you're reflecting, you know, try to be original, refer directly to the original materials and to your original diagnostic. So when you're doing pie structure, make sure that you are providing illustrations that are both the original diagnostic that you wrote and also revised material. And use the course material to support you. The course material is going to be an authoritative source that you can use in order to establish any definitions or how a process should look, how a paper should look. And last but not least, you want to check it. These are your revision strategies. Try to finish your paper a day early if you can. That way you can let it cool off, walk away from it for a little while, try not to think about it, and then come back with a fresh look. Edit in layers as you're going through an essay and you're editing. Always, you know, read a paragraph, edit that paragraph, then go back, edit that paragraph again, and then go back one more time, then go on to the next paragraph, and then go back up too. But just make sure that when you're doing that, because a lot of times when I'm reading essays, what I'll see is a student has edited in layers, but they've devoted much more time to the first point than the second and third point, and you usually see the paper sort of drifting off in quality. So just make sure that while you're editing in layers, you're still paying attention equally to all the parts of your paper. Reading it aloud can be really useful, or if you have a roommate or a friend who's willing to read it to you. A lot of times I hear errors that I don't see, and so it's good if you can read it, and then read it backwards. And when I say to read a paper backwards, I don't mean what I mean for you to do. I'm just going to go back to this sample paper again. And this is a strategy for reading for sentence level errors, primarily grammatical errors. Go to the bottom of the essay and read just the very last sentence as it stands alone. So I would read, Therefore, I believe that if I fully acquire these and apply them to my next essay, I will be able to step forward to a successful essay. Okay. And then you make decisions if there's any corrections or errors, then read the sentence before that. Then read the sentence before that. And what this does is, what happens is when you've spent so much time with a piece of your own, you already know what's there, and it's like even if there's an error, you could read over it 5 times, you might not notice it. And so what you can do by reading backwards is it forces you to read and isolate each of the sentences on their own instead of reading them in context. So a lot of time you can catch sentence level errors or punctuation errors by reading your essay backwards. So this has been some tips for approaching Essay 1, the diagnostic analysis. Good luck.